Hi, everybody. Thank you all to being here. As you know, my name is Vartan for Football Armor Apologetics. This is a very, very special session that we're doing here today. The person right here in front of me is born on July 6, 1964, and is an American Bible scholar and Jewish theologian. He's a professor of Bible at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America and a senior fellow of the Shalom Hartman Institute. He's a former director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish Studies at Northwestern University. His research encompasses around areas of biblical theology, history of Israelite religion, and modern Jewish thought. He's the author of A Prophet Reads Scripture, an allusion in Isaiah 40 to 60, 66, the bodies of God in the ancient world of Israel, by which we'll touch upon in a second, and Revelation and Authority at Sinai in Jewish scripture and tradition. And he was elected at the membership in the Biblical Colloquium in 2014 and in the membership of the American Academy for Jewish Research. The man in front of me today is Dr. Benjamin D. Sommer. Sir, it is a delight to have you.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a delight to be here.
Awesome. And it actually is, as I showed before, the topic of today is the bodies of God in the ancient world of Israel. And like, for those who can see, like, I studied this subject very diligently. It is a technical subject, but that's something I really like. I like long conversations so that we can like pack out spiritual meat, as I'd like to say. So my first question to you is, what sparked your interest in this topic, and how did this book came to be?
That's actually a very interesting question, and gosh, I tell me if I'm going on a little bit too long with this answer.
Go ahead, as long as you want.
The way this book came into being is a little bit unusual, I think, for an academic book. I was searching for a topic for my second book. My first book was a much more specific study of the poetry found in the last part of the book of Isaiah. For my second book, I wanted to do something a bit broader. And I was just curious about, first of all, I was just curious about some terminology that shows up in the Hebrew Bible that refers to the presence of God. There are a number of Hebrew terms, often translated as glory, name, face, that refer to God's presence in the Bible. In Hebrew, these would be kavod, Shem, and Panim, to mention three of the most prominent ones. And I was just wondering, why are these different names or these different terms used to describe God's presence in the world? Why do biblical authors want to use different technical terms to describe God as being present in some way, or maybe in a number of different ways in the world? And I was generally just, I think, interested in the whole question of divine presence and divine absence, in part, I think, just as a religious person who is troubled by divine absence in the world, and interested in divine presence in the world. So I think that there was sort of an academic interest. As a scholar, I was just wondering about the use of these technical terms. And as a religious person, I was interested in the subject itself of divine presence. So I decided to write a book on this subject, and I wrote up a proposal for an American foundation describing what I'm going to do, in this book. Although the truth is, I really had no idea. But I was able to, on the basis of this proposal, I got a sabbatical. I went to Israel for a year, and I spent a year really just reading. I think a lot of scholars, when they start writing a book, they have a very specific idea of what they want to do. They already have a thesis, and they're kind of charging towards that thesis. I really did not have a thesis. I didn't have a specific answer to a question. I didn't really even have a very specific question other than what's going on with all these different terms for divine presence in the Bible. So instead of really focusing on supporting a thesis that I already had, I spent most of the year just reading biblical texts in Hebrew, reading some texts that were related in other languages from the ancient world, and reading a great deal of secondary literature, a great deal of modern scholarship by Christian and Jewish scholars on the Bible and on ancient Near Eastern religions. And towards the end of the year, I still didn't really have much written, which was kind of a problem. In the meantime, completely unrelated to my book project, I had promised two friends of mine who are also professors that I would write an essay for a book they wanted to edit on the theme of beginnings in the Bible. And so I thought, I've got to somehow figure out an essay on the theme of beginnings that would relate somehow to the idea of divine presence. And I noticed that a lot of texts in the Bible that talk about a beginning also talk implicitly or explicitly about the theme of exile, or talk about the difference between home and exile. The Garden of Eden story talks about home and exile. The Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden. The beginning of the Jewish people, of the Israelite nation, Abraham is told to leave his home and to go to a new home, so that there's some question, okay, it's about home and exile, but there's a bit of an ambiguity as to what the home is and what the exile is. This happens a lot with texts that deal with beginning. And I realized that, well, maybe that relates to the idea of when God is at home and when God is at exile, and where is God at home and where is God in exile. Is the planet Earth, is our world a place that it's appropriate for God to be, so that it's God's home, or is God in exile to the extent that God is interacting with us on the planet Earth? In any event, I thought, okay, that'll be a topic that deals with both with this beginnings theme that I promised to my friends I would write about, and the theme that I had told my university I was writing a book about. I wrote a long, long article. And then I went and spoke to a professor at Hebrew University, Yair Zakovitz. He's retired by now. He was already by then a very, very prominent biblical scholar. And he was sort of my mentor for the year that, as a junior faculty member, a younger scholar, I was spending the year in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University. We used to meet. We would just talk through various issues. He never gave me any advice the whole year. The closest he came to ever giving me advice as a mentor, because he was officially, he had the job of being my mentor at the Hebrew University. The closest thing he did to giving me advice was he read this really long article I wrote, and he said to me in Hebrew, "Ata lo merachem ala koreh." He said, "You don't take pity on the reader." In other words, you're not very nice to your reader. That was the only piece of advice he gave me, and even then, it was only advice by implication. But I realized he was right. This article was too long. I figured out a way to make it into two different articles. And then I had these two different articles that could, one of which I sent to my friends, my friend's collection of essays that they were writing. And I was able to say plausibly when I came back to my university, okay, I've written something on this topic. I'm making progress on this book. But I still didn't really exactly know where the book was going to go. I had read a lot. I had learned a lot. I had thought a lot. I'd even written a bit, but I still didn't really know where the book would go. A year or two later, another friend asked me to come to Indiana University to present a paper at a conference there that dealt with the theme of, what was the theme of that? Selfhood, the idea of the self in the ancient world. And I thought, well, I've got to do something on the self that will relate somehow to this idea of divine presence. So I thought, I'll write about about divine selfhood. How is God's self as a person portrayed in the Bible? And I figured, I've got to talk for 20, 25 minutes. If I can just come up with 10 pages, it's enough for me to go to this conference, and it'll somehow contribute to this book project in which I'm not making much progress. So I had an idea. I sat down to write up the idea. It took me like 3 months. And when I was done, it was 86 pages long. It was much too long for my friend's conference. But I realized, oh my gosh, this is the book. This is the book on divine presence that I've been trying to write for a long time. Instead of shortening these 86 pages down to 10 pages, I just need to make them a little longer. And I realized that these 86 pages could become 3 different chapters, which are actually chapters 1, 2, and 3 of the book. Mm-hmm. And then I realized that those 2 articles I had written when I was in Israel about home and exile, those 2 articles actually unfolded an implication of the basic insight that I'm expressing in these 86 pages. In other words, they kind of come after those 86 pages, even though I had written them 2 years earlier, but they actually relate to this topic as the implication of what I was talking about in these 86 pages. Then I actually was able to get another sabbatical, spent another year in Israel. And during that year, I took those 2 articles, I took those 86 pages, I put them together, I rewrote a lot of material, I added some material, and that's how the book was written. It was a very odd way of writing a book. It's not, it's a sort of risky way. It's not the way most scholars work. I kind of let the ideas take me where they would take me, and they took me in a number of surprising directions. The direction they took me in terms of the Trinity was very surprising for me. And instead of sort of imposing my idea on the literature, I spent many years on the book. I let the book I let those ideas and those texts take me in the direction that they took me. And that's how the book ended up being written. And in a sense, it was written backwards. I wrote the end of the book first, and then I wrote the beginning of the book, even though I think it flows pretty well in the order in which the chapters are now.
100%. That was an amazing explanation of how the book came to be. And I'm not that much of a book reader. I have a couple of books around me, but I do notice, of course, that when you're writing a book, you already have a thesis in your mind. You have something to prove, and then you work doing like a reverse psychology in order to get that point across. But you were actually like all the way throughout time, you were letting the work do itself as a figure of speech. Exactly. As your teacher in Jerusalem said, you are not very nice for the reader. But then the question is, did you do that on purpose? I would say no, right?
Oh, no, I certainly not. I mean, and he was right about that article was too long. It had too many twists and turns, and it worked better as 2 separate articles. So at that point, I hope that I was nice to the reader. But the odd coincidence is that those two articles, which in a revised form became chapters 4 and 5 of the book, they really sort of describe an implication of what I talk about, especially in chapters 2 and 3 of the book. So I wrote them in the opposite order, but yeah, I really just kind of let the material take me where it would take me. And so it took me longer to write this book than a lot of professors take when they're writing their books. I think I had a lot more fun with it than some professors have when they're writing books, because the material really surprised me, and it took me in directions I wouldn't have anticipated at all at the beginning.
Yeah, like there has become, for the past, I don't know how many years, there is this category of books by which this book, in my perception, came into be. Like other books are, for instance, are also like from Daniel Boyarin, Borderlines, somewhat of the same theme that you're touching upon.
Yeah.
And of course, Alan F. Siegel, Two Powers in Heaven, is also has been a very influential book. I like devoured this book. There are like so many markings, as you can see. But there's also one else, which is a very big book of Moshe Idel, Ben's sonship, and you referenced him in your book at a particular moment.
Yeah, that book is I don't know. Wait, I don't know if people can see my if this will be on a screen, but yeah, sonship is it's probably a little.
Oh, you have it there on the.
Yeah, it's right right on top of my finger. Right. Yeah, that's the Moshe Idel section right there. The black one, that's sonship. Yeah.
Oh, also. Yeah, we're going to touch upon Moshe Idel in a moment. But I do notice that there's within the Judaic exegetical scholarly realm, it's amazing to see how it actually like comes into everything what comes out of it.
Gotcha. But I should add, by the way, Alan Siegel's books are over there, but they're not on camera. They're kind of off camera. Not the one that you've got, but another one of his is over there.
There's also another one coming in. I ordered it 2 weeks ago, which is Peter Schaefer's Two Powers in Heaven. Same thesis as Alan F. Siegel's. He's also one of a Jewish renowned scholar, etc. So.
Yeah, no, and Schaefer is a great scholar of Jewish studies, a very, very important scholar of Jewish studies. He himself is not Jewish.
Right.
He's a German Christian. I mean, I don't know if he's religious or not, but he's a tremendously learned and creative scholar of ancient Judaism and medieval Judaism. He really works in both areas.
Yeah, I cannot wait to read his books. But a moment ago, you were referring towards selfhood. And a very common theme within your book is this term that you coined, fluidity of selfhood. And as I was reading your book, of course, being someone who has studied the Bible for a couple of years, of course, you have to be a bit satiated with the scriptures in order to make the connections. Like the reference I always give it is like a crossword puzzle. Now, like there's all these gaps, and then you're trying to figure out, wait, the solution to that is that, and then you can do that, and then you can do that. So all these verses coming together and make this cohesive argument, like a big argument. But the thing I learned first time ever were, of course, the shem, the kabot. There was the third one,
Panim.
Panim, exactly.
Panim.
Like, and I was always interested in how did the Bible speak about God? And as you mentioned before, that was the first question, like the presence of God within creation, for instance. But what is your own understanding of fluidity in the selfhood? How did you come up with that?
So this idea of fluidity is found, I think, in many ancient Near Eastern religions, not only in ancient Israelite religion. I really noticed it first studying Babylonian and Assyrian texts, and also studying ancient Canaanite texts. And something that confused me a little bit as I was reading those texts was that you often would get multiple gods or goddesses who had the same name, like Ishtar, let's say, or Baal, but they had different locations. There were local Ishtars or local Baal gods who had a connection to a certain place, and so they were sort of different from each other. They could even be mentioned together as if though they're different characters in a single prayer or in a single ritual. This happens actually quite often, that the Baal of this location and the Baal of that location both receive offerings at a temple as if though they're separate gods. This happens with various gods in Mesopotamia as well. Baal's more of a Canaanite god. This happens with goddesses in Mesopotamia. Ishtar is sometimes mentioned. Two different Ishtars will be mentioned in the same prayer. So they're different from each other. And yet fundamentally, they're really not that different from each other. They seem to have different identities in that you pray to them, you pray to the one and you pray to the other. And yet they're almost the exact same, because you pray to them separately in the same prayer, or you're giving them offerings in the same ritual, and they're doing the same thing. They're acting together. So they seem to be different, but also somewhat the same. Furthermore, when you leave, let's say, the world of ritual and prayer, sacrifice and prayer, and you go to the world of ancient Babylonian or Assyrian or Canaanite mythology, then there's just one of them. When these actors appear as characters in a myth, there's just Ishtar, or there's just Baal, or there's just, whatever god it happens to be. And so it seems that these gods were simultaneously the same and different. There are also ancient Assyrian, Babylonian texts that seem to describe one god as being a part of another god, so that a god or a goddess could sort of overlap with another god or goddess. When you think of all of these texts, one just gets the impression that for the ancient Babylonians, Assyrians, and Canaanites, there is an extent to which deities had a fluid self. For you and me, we're human beings, and I'm me and you're you, and that's the end of the story. There aren't two me's. Even if I had an identical twin brother, which I happen not to, but other people do, we might look the same, but we're two different people. We're in two different places. We'd be, living different lives. You and I might have a lot of interests in common. We might have a lot of similarities, but we're two different people. We don't overlap. And as individuals, we don't sort of split into multiple individuals who are the same, even though we're not the same. But with the gods and goddesses of the ancient Near East, that could actually happen. A god could become more than one god, located in several places simultaneously, while remaining in essence the same God. And at least temporarily, there are texts in which the self of one God could manifest itself as another God, or could even overlap with another God. That happens less frequently, but there are several texts where that happens. Or where one God is described as being an aspect or even a body part of another God. That there are several texts that from Mesopotamia in which various deities are all described as being body parts of one particular deity. So the idea of the self of a god in the ancient Near East or of a goddess was different than the self of a human being. And I think that that's part of what made the category of God different from the category of human in the ancient Near Eastern way of thinking that I'm describing from Babylonia, Canaan, and Assyria. There's some evidence that this happens, I think, a little bit in Egypt as well. Having noticed that in ancient Near Eastern texts, reading very, very slowly some parts of Genesis and Exodus especially, I noticed that you actually get a similar idea showing up occasionally in the Bible. Now, there is this idea in modern biblical scholarship, some of your listeners might know, that the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are not a unity, but were put together from several independent documents, from several documents that had existed in ancient Israel originally on their own. Scholars usually refer to these texts as J, E, P, and D. There's some debate about the theory, but there's 3 or 4 main blocks of material, the P or priestly material, the D or Deuteronomic material, and then everything else, which might be divided between 2 different categories of J and E, or might not. There's disagreement on that point. What I noticed was that when the fluidity idea shows up, it shows up specifically in what some scholars call the JE material, either in the document that used to be called the J document or the one that used to be called the E document. And that P and D actually, not only do they not have this idea, they seem, I think, to be arguing against this idea. They seem to know about it, but they seem to not like this idea. And so I think that the idea of divine fluidity that I notice in ancient Near Eastern polytheistic texts, I think it also shows up in monotheistic texts from ancient Israel, and then other monotheistic texts from ancient Israel reject that fluidity model. So I think that I really noticed this first by looking at non-biblical texts, which are closely related to the Bible. And once I saw this more clearly there, I began to see it in the Bible as well. And once I saw it in the Bible, I began to notice that other biblical authors seem to know about this idea and they don't like it and they argue against it.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But what is then would be done your own understanding of, or more like the general understanding of monotheism? Would that then particularly be of the fundamental God of like, how do you actually make a distinction that it has, the God of Israel has like this fluidity of self, but at the same time, it's also monotheism. But how, what's then your understanding of monotheism in that context?
Yeah, great question. Because initially what one might think, well, the fluidity idea shows up in Babylonia and Assyria and Canaan. It must be it's a polytheistic idea. It's a whole different way of conceiving of divinity. And monotheism is different. In monotheism, there's one God who has one self. But when you look more closely, I think that turns out not to be the case for a few reasons. First of all, archaic and classical Greek texts, Homer, Hesiod, even much later Greek texts from the time of the tragedians and even later than that, when they're talking about the gods, they're clearly polytheistic. They believe in many gods, but they never talk about this fluidity idea. These are polytheistic texts for whom the gods are more similar to human beings. They don't have fluid cells that can split into different parts while retaining a certain unity, and they don't overlap with each other the way they do over in the ancient Near East. So polytheism, it can have the fluidity point of view, or it can have the non-fluidity point of view when it's talking about the deities. If polytheism can have a fluidity theology or a non-fluidity theology that suggests the possibility that, well, maybe monotheism might be able to have a monotheistic fluidity theology or a non-monotheistic fluidity, or a monotheistic non-fluidity theology. And that's, I think, what's happening in the Bible. The texts like the JE texts or parts of Psalms or parts of Isaiah that do display what I'm calling the fluidity model, they don't believe that other gods or goddesses are real powers in the universe. They don't believe that it's legitimate for Israelites to pray to other gods and goddesses. They believe that Israelites should pray only to the one God. They believe that that this one God is the only creator of the universe, but they also believe that God, probably in God's graciousness, God allows God's self to manifest itself in the world in a smaller, more user-friendly, easier to confront format. And so God can manifest God's self in the world, not in God's full self, which would be frightening, overpowering, even deadly, but in some very small scale way. That's what happens, for example, to Moses at the burning bush. That's what happens to Abraham when the three visitors come to Abraham. These human characters are meeting God in those passages, but meeting God in a much, much smaller, user-friendly fashion. They're not meeting other gods. They're not meeting multiple gods. So these are not polytheistic texts. These are still monotheistic texts, but they're monotheistic texts that are saying God can make God's self available to humanity in a smaller scale format that's easier to handle. By the way, you get a similar idea. You get a similar idea in Babylonia, which is where you are dealing with polytheism. Interestingly, you get this idea in Hinduism as well. And in Hinduism, of course, many Hindus are polytheists. They believe in the existence of many deities, but many Hindus are actually really monotheistic because they believe that all these different deities are, in fact, different manifestations of one single underlying reality. And those deities are lots of smaller scale, how might you put this? They're smaller scales manifestations of other manifestations of this one ultimate reality. So you can get this fluidity idea showing up in monotheism in Judaism, and I think also in Christianity. You can get this idea showing up in purely polytheistic religions such as ancient Babylonia, and you can also get it showing up in Hinduism, which is really both a monotheistic and a polytheistic religion. There's a form of, for example, of Hinduism known as Advaita Vedanta. In Advaita Vedanta religion, it's certainly the case that all the deities are manifestations of a single reality. The word for these manifestations is avatara in Sanskrit. And so there you've got this idea showing up in a Hindu monotheistic context. In fact, I think that the idea of an avatara, although that's a Sanskrit Indian term, I think it really does, that's a very appropriate way for understanding what shem and kavod and panim are in the Bible. That in some biblical texts, not all of them, but in some biblical texts, God's name is an avatara, an avatar of God that's available for the people of Israel on the planet Earth.
Right. Yeah. Scripturally speaking, what you're saying, that there are so many examples to give. One of my favorites is, of course, Exodus 23, 20 verses 22, for instance, where God says to Moses, listen to that angel, for mine Shem is in him. But then at the same time, we see in Deuteronomy 12, verse 4 up until 11, he says that my name will be among you. So, but then and you really enjoy the way how the Bible is using anthropomorphic language for God being in creation. And as you mentioned before, it's highly dangerous, but still God in his energies, like in his activities, can come into a theophany towards us without us like blowing up in an instant as a figure of speech.
Yeah.
So,
and in that passage you mentioned from Exodus 23, that's a very interesting example. because the word angel in that passage, I think, malach in Hebrew, that's a case where malach really is an avatar. And in other words, in biblical Hebrew, the word malach really has two different meanings. The primary meaning is messenger. So God, when God sends an angel in the sense of a messenger, which is the more frequent use of the term, that's some being who's different from God, whom God is sending on a mission. That being might be a heavenly being. There are cases where that the term is applied to human beings, but that's somebody who's different from God. And that's what we usually think of an angel as being, some heavenly creature with wings that flutters down here and does something on God's behalf. But there are some cases in the Bible where the malach is clearly very closely related to God, is not a being separate from God on a mission for God, but is a small-scale manifestation of God on the planet Earth. And so in Exodus 23, when God says, okay, I'm not going to go with you through the Sinai wilderness, because that would be too much, but I will allow my manifestation to go with you, and my name is in that manifestation. So that manifestation is God, but it isn't all of God. It's a smaller scale descent of God into the universe, but it doesn't encompass all of God. And so in that case, I'd say that the Hebrew word malach would better be translated as avatar rather than angel in the sense that we usually think of angel. It's not a being who's a messenger. It's actually a being who is part of God, but is just not all of God.
Right. Wow. I never thought of the term of avatar for it, but I understand what you mean with that word. And the example that you just mentioned before makes a lot of sense.
Right. And so in Hinduism, let's say, one deity may be the same as another deity. So Krishna, for example, is an avatar of Vishnu. Vishnu is a huge heavenly god. Krishna is a deity who's much more human in form. He's really the same thing as Vishnu, but he's much more approachable. I think something very similar is happening in in Exodus 23. That malach is a smaller scale manifestation of the heavenly God, of the one heavenly God.
One thing within that own context, we have like, of course, we have like Exodus 23, 20 verse 22, but then in Exodus 24 verse 1, it says, God said to Moses, come up to God. Like me as a Trinitarian, when I hear that, I would say, like, why wouldn't God say, come up to me? Like he's referring you towards the Shem or the angel or the avatar, for instance. So, and you see, of course, like in Genesis 19:24, Yahweh rained down from Yahweh out of heaven, and so all these type of things. But what I particularly want to go into is like the anthropomorphization of God. We read, for instance, in Genesis 3 verse 8, for the cool of God was walking in the cool of the day, for instance, implying that a voice has legs. That was one of the first verses that you started to exegete. Why would you actually say, what were the first Jewish exegetes talking about when they came across those type of verses?
So Jewish interpreters of the Bible, in the post-biblical period, I think some of them, the truth is, some of them have no problem with that anthropomorphism. It's interesting. We nowadays think of anthropomorphic portrayals of God as being a problem. They've got to be sort of explained away. But in the ancient world, the rabbis, for example, and other ancient Jewish interpreters, I don't think that they had that same problem with anthropomorphic references to God. It was really more in the Middle Ages, as Jews became more and more familiar with Greek philosophy, especially Jews who lived in the Arab world and were able to read the works of Arabic Muslim philosophers, and also the works of Greek philosophers that have been translated to Arabic. It's only then that we really see, with maybe with one ancient exception, that we really see Jewish philosophers unhappy about anthropomorphism. So it's with, let's say, Saadia Gaon, with Maimonides in the 10th, the 12th century, that we see attempts to say, well, this looks anthropomorphic, but it's only speaking symbolically. This isn't to be taken literally. The rabbis, though, from 1,000 years earlier than that, or from 800 or 500 years earlier than that, the rabbis of the Talmudic era, the rabbis who produced the interpretations known as Midrash, they actually, I think, don't have any trouble with that anthropomorphism. They're just as, I think that they think that God does have a body, and that body can sometimes be more or less accurately described in terms that sound similar to a human body. Not identical, but similar.
Yeah,
it's later on that Sa'ad Gaon, the first great Jewish philosopher who had a real impact within Jewish tradition, and then later Maimonides, who is to this day the most important and most influential Jewish philosopher, that they insisted, no, God doesn't have a body. God is not a material substance. But both the biblical authors and I think the rabbinic authors, they assumed that God was a substance, that God had some sort of physical presence, maybe more than one physical presence. It was different than the physical presence of a human being in any of a number of ways, but it was still for them some sort of physical reality.
Right, yeah. That's something, it is very interesting that within the domain of Judaism, like for the normal layman, we would think that Judaism is monolithic. But actually, I wouldn't say it's fractured, but you have different opinions. Like the book that I mentioned before, like Alan F. Siegel, he particularly describes the Jews of the particular time as the minim, right? The heretics, like those type of folks who have that type of belief, etc. But the exegetical discussion that they were having did leave us all these documents and archaeological facts of what the people at the particular time were thinking. And he perfectly like shows the not necessarily the person, but the arguments, like the scriptural arguments that show us the anthropomorphic language of God, and the fluidity and multiple figures of God in a monotheistic sense. And one thing in particular, you mentioned also, of course, Moshe Idel. And I didn't read this book entirely. I did read like the conclusion. Like it's very intimidating. Like we'll have to take the time to study this one. But Moshe Idel being, in my opinion, a highly underrated person. Like this book won, like in 2007, the prize of Israel of like literature on this particular book. So to say that these are fringe groups, would that be like? Would it be honest to say that these were fringe groups?
That is the Kabbalistic authors who have about whom Idel is speaking. No, I think that a lot of 19th century German Jewish, Central European Jewish scholars wanted to describe those mystics, those mikubalim, to use the Hebrew term, as being a fringe group. They wanted to say, no, Judaism, we're all about Maimonides. We're all about this philosophical stuff. We're not anthropomorphic. We've got a respectable religion, so you can let us have the right to vote. Is basically, that's a little bit of a quick summary that simplifies things a little bit, but that's what the 19th century German Jewish scholars were saying. But that wasn't really an accurate description of Judaism, because in saying that the Kabbalists, the Mekubalim, were a fringe, they were an awfully big fringe. In Eastern Europe, for example, the popular mystical movement, or the popular Kabbalistic movement that began to develop in the 18th century, known as Hasidism, in large parts of Eastern Europe, most of the Jews were supporters of Hasidism. And even if you look at all of Eastern Europe together, it's probably over half the Jews of Eastern Europe were either Hasidic or very closely related to the Hasidic Jews. That's a big fringe. It's hard to describe that as a fringe. You go to other parts of the Jewish world, Morocco, Yemen, Mesopotamia, or what today is called Iraq. Kabbalism was very, very popular, deeply, deeply influential in those areas. So something that Moshe Idel points out, and this is already true even a few generations before Idel in the work of Gershom Scholem, that no, this wasn't a fringe movement. This was, and in many ways continues to be, a very important form of Judaism. Part of what I'm doing in my book, in my book on the bodies of God, I mean, I just talked about this in the last chapter, is I'm trying to suggest that the debate between Jewish rationalists and Jewish mystics that we see in later Judaism, in the Middle Ages, and even into the modern world, it really is a much older debate, because there were predecessors to the Kabbalists and to their ideas that God comes into the world in a number of different forms that seem almost to be competing with each other, but are ultimately harmonious. That conception of God is actually a much, much older conception of God. It doesn't just show up in medieval Jewish mysticism. It has roots in the Bible itself. The medieval rationalist view of God, which focuses much more on God's unity and doesn't believe that God is in any sense fluid, that sort of stricter, more austere form of monotheism, I think it also has a biblical predecessor. I think the book of Deuteronomy, I think the priestly literature from the Bible is a predecessor to that way of thinking. And so this much later debate really sort of repeats a debate that's happening within the biblical corpus itself. But the two sides of that debate, I don't think it's possible to describe them, either of them, as a fringe movement. They're both very, very vital in their own historical periods.
Nice, awesome. So when I alluded towards Moshe Idel, and I alluded already towards the term Intra-Deical dynamism, in order to give a bit of, as far as my perception allows me, like we see that throughout the Bible there are, as I call, powers or avatars, as you mentioned before, or in Trinitarian Christian terms, like persons. Like the word person, as you may know, does not necessarily imply just a human being or something that has cognition or a will, or it has emotions and stuff like that. So, but what is your opinion on what is happening within God when intra-deical dynamism, meaning there's a dynamic within the deity? But what would be your understanding concerning, like the Malach Yahweh, for instance, or the Ruch El Qudus, like the Holy Spirit, and this type of stuff? What would be your opinion on that particular term?
So Professor Moshe Idel talks about this sort of dynamism within God as occurring in Kabbalistic literature, and there it's actually fairly explicit. There are descriptions of how this part of the manifestation of God within the cosmos interacts with that part. There's an extent to which different parts of God are separate from each other within the world, but they're never totally separate. They don't become independent beings whom you could pray to. That's really forbidden in standard Kabbalah. They don't become different beings, and you can't pray to this one instead of that one. But they have, and they're always either in harmony with each other, or returning to harmony with each other. Maybe they return to harmony with each other ultimately in the fullness of time, but they also return to full harmony with each other on the Jewish Sabbath as they interact, as one of them moves through another to enter a third. And there are descriptions of this, for example, in the Zohar, the classic, one of the classic works of Jewish mysticism, of how a more masculine manifestation of God in the universe enters into what's known as the Shekhinah, or the Malchut, which is a more feminine aspect of God in the universe. And that coming together is described actually in sexual terms. That's what happens within God on the Sabbath. If you're describing these two aspects of God as essentially having sex with each other, that's a dynamic relationship. Something's happening between these two sides. And yet the Kabbalists don't consider themselves to be polytheists. These aren't different beings. These are just different manifestations, different sides, different aspects, different faces of a single being. So there's an extent to which the deity's manifestations in this world are different manifestations, but they either are in harmony with each other or they come into harmony with each other in the Messianic era or on the Sabbath, which is a little bit of a precursor of the Messianic era that recurs every 7 days. So I think that's very roughly, very in a very quick fashion, what Moshe is talking about, what Moshe Idel is talking about when he's talking about this dynamism that happens within the deity. What I'd like to suggest is that already in the Bible, there are hints of something similar. That in the Bible, for one thing, you at least have these different manifestations of God. And in some parts of the Bible, like the JE texts from the Pentateuch, there can be more than one manifestation. There can be God's name, but also there can be God's face. And they overlap with each other, but they're not the exact same thing as each other. I don't think that the Bible goes into a description and a story, a narrative, the way the Zohar does in Kabbalah of these interactions. But if nothing else, I think that they're occasionally implied, especially because part of this idea of God's fluidity in the Bible is that some biblical texts, they're a minority. I wouldn't say they're just a fringe, but they are definitely a minority of the biblical texts, suggest that God can become present in physical things, in physical objects, in particular in stone pillars, like the pillar that Jacob sets up in Bethel or Luz in the book of Genesis. God can also become present in wood or in a bush. For example, the bush that Exodus 3, where Moses sees the Malach Adonai, which I would translate not as angel of God, but avatar of God. We know from ancient Canaanite religion that a male god would sometimes be present in a stone pillar, and there was a goddess who was present in a bush, the name or in a tree. The name of that goddess was Asherah. In the Bible, the word Asherah shows up dozens and dozens and dozens of times. But when you look through every single one of them, there are only a handful of cases, you can count them on one hand, where the word Asherah is referring to the goddess or to an object that is associated with the goddess. In the vast majority of cases, the Asherah is some sort of object that may actually be sacred to the God of Israel, the God whose name would be spelled Yahweh, which following Jewish tradition I don't pronounce out loud. And there are some passages in which it's quite clear that there are very zealous monotheistic worshipers of that God, of the one God, who use an Asherah in their worship in the temple. There are temples that actually contain an Asherah, Israelite temples that contain an Asherah. And by the time we're talking about these texts from the 8th century, the 7th century, the term there isn't being used in reference to the goddess Asherah. It's actually just a name for a wooden pole or some sort of tree that is not merely a symbol, but is actually thought of as a manifestation of the one God. Now, in older Canaanite temples, and maybe in older Israelite temples, probably in some older Israelite temples, it's probably the case that the temple had both a pillar made of stone and a bush or a tree or a wooden stick. And the pillar was thought of as being a manifestation of the God whose name is spelled Yahweh. And the bush or the wood or the tree is understood as being a manifestation of the goddess Asherah, who probably was thought of as being God's wife. But by the time we get to the book of Kings or the book of Hosea, which mention an Asherah, and they don't mention it disapprovingly, they don't disapprove of the Asherah, I think it's clear that for them, the Asherah was a manifestation of the God Hashem. That as monotheism took greater and greater root in Israel, the God, the one God, sort of took over the role of both God and goddess. And so the Asherah that was present in the Israelite temple was not now thought of as being a symbol of this other goddess who was God's wife. It's just thought of as being a manifestation of God himself. And if that's the case, then there are these two very different kinds of representations of the one God, one of which is more clearly masculine, one of which is more clearly feminine. One can imagine them interacting, although there are no biblical texts that describe that explicitly. But I think that when Kabbalah, centuries and centuries, in fact, millennia later, describes one aspect of God as having sex with another aspect, I don't think that that's as radical and new an idea as one might initially assume it is. I think that that's actually a reappearance of an idea that was there all along, that because God is not literally male or female, or because God is simultaneously male and female, God can have sex with God. But that's not sex of one being with another. That's something different than what we would literally think of as sexual.
Like, for instance, God begets in his own way, not in our way, for instance.
Correct.
And
Yeah.
when we say God has sex with God, we have to be very considerate in what type of way we're looking at. But I get what your point.
Not in a physical way, because God never begets in a physical way in the Hebrew Bible. That in the Hebrew Bible, it's a really important point that God is not a sexual being. And yet lurking in the background of some biblical texts, not the priestly ones, not the Deuteronomic ones, but the JE texts, lurking behind them is maybe a little bit of a cultural memory of a feminine and a masculine side of God. And that becomes much, much more prominent in Jewish mysticism over 1,000 years later.
Right. But there are certain cases within the Bible where, for instance, in Isaiah 63 verse 14 or Isaiah 66, I would say Isaiah 66:13, I don't know. It says that God has looked upon her kid as a mother. Or in Proverbs 8:22, it says that the wisdom of God was brought forth. That's sort of like he begot the wisdom. So there is like this feminine way of ascribing towards God, but that's also, of course, allegorical. But as you mentioned before, God is not male or female, or male and female at the same time, which is a very interesting topic.
Right.
You want to say something?
Right. That last part of the book of Isaiah, so you mentioned 66:13. This theme shows up earlier also from 40 through 66. There are multiple cases in which a simile or a metaphor, usually actually a simile, is used in which God is compared to a mother. God is like a mother comforting her children. That happens again and again, especially in the last part of the book of Isaiah, that God is compared to a mother. There's a scholar named Meir Gruber from Ben Gurion University in Israel, who has written on this. He has a collection, a book called The Motherhood of God.
I think I've heard of it. I've heard of it. Yeah.
Contains an essay that goes through all of these passages in Isaiah 40 through 66. It's a consistent tendency of that section of the Bible. Another scholar, Mark Brettler, who teaches now at Duke University, used to teach at Brandeis University in the United States, he wrote an article in which he goes through some of those metaphors and similes that Gruber points out. And Mark Brettler notices that very, very often when these passages in Isaiah compare God to a mother, they also compare God to something very masculine, to a warrior, for example. Or they say God is like a mother, but then they say God is not like a mother. They seem to want to give us multiple contradictory metaphors and similes to describe God. And Brettler suggests this is because they want to remind us that none of these are literally true. God isn't a father. God isn't a mother. God isn't a warrior. God is like all of these things, but God isn't any of these things. And those are texts, I think, that that really want to remind us these are only comparisons, these are only similes, these are only figures of speech, because they're all trying to describe a reality that is beyond language.
Right. As you 100% know, Isaiah 55 verse 8, for my thoughts are higher than your thoughts, and my ways higher than your ways. But still, at the same time, me personally, I am of the conviction that the Bible speaks in anthropocentric language, meaning that the human mind can fathom it. that we have, as Ecclesiastes 3:11 says, that God has put eternity in our hearts. We have like this faculty in order to wrestle with God, as he has done with Jacob, as a metaphorically speaking. So there is this aspect that we cannot know him, which I think every theist agrees with that. And then there's just another part where we are invited to know him, or there are some clues about him that our curiosity just wants to investigate more into. Right?
Yeah, so I think in Isaiah, we're invited to know God. We're reminded that we can't really know God because, as you point out in 55:8, God is just outside of our ability to quite conceptualize. But in some ways, we're invited to sort of misunderstand God in a number of overlapping but competing ways. And that the right set of misunderstanding sends us in the correct direction.
Right.
In a way, I think that what's happening with these fluidity texts, now Isaiah 6:55 or 40 through 66 is not a fluidity text. It's not one of the texts that has this fluidity idea. But I think that the fluidity texts in their own way are trying to reckon with the problem of anthropomorphism. That when we anthropomorphize God, when we attribute a human kind of a body to God, we're minimizing God in a way that's very, very problematic. So what these fluidity texts are doing is they're saying, well, God has many persons, God has many selves, God has many bodies even in the world that are different from each other but overlapping, and they're all merely manifestations of a heavenly reality. But even when God is being described in a very anthropomorphic way in one of these, what I'm calling the fluidity texts, like you mentioned, Genesis 3, where God is walking through the garden, God or God's voice has legs because God is walking. Or Genesis 18, where 3 different men appear to Abraham, and at least one of them, possibly all 3 of them, are God, but not all of God. In texts like that, I think that we're being reminded, well, God looks on the one hand very, very human. In Genesis 18, Abraham doesn't even realize that he's dealing with God initially. These men look so human. He just thinks he's dealing with
he was washing their feet, and he was giving them food, like you and me. Yeah.
And he has no idea that this is actually God until about the middle to the end of the chapter. And towards the middle or the end of the chapter, he begins to catch on, and he starts realizing who he's dealing with. So he only like the narrator in Genesis 18 tells us readers at the very, very beginning that that this is God, but Abraham only realizes that later on. So these are manifestations of God that look very human, but we're at the same time when we put them all together, we realize they're massively different from a human being, because we humans have only one body. We have only one self. We can't fragment while remaining unified. If you take us apart, we're just dead. We can't overlap with somebody else, but God is really radically different and radically mysterious, precisely for the fluidity texts, precisely because God has more than one body, more than one manifestation. God can be a unity even when God is a plurality. That's why these, I think, are still monotheistic texts. There's still only one deity, but this deity has multiple manifestations. So in a funny way, I think that the fluidity texts, although initially they seem a little more polytheistic, and they do share something for real with actual polytheistic texts from ancient Canaan, Assyria, and Babylonia, I think that in their own sophisticated way, they're also very monotheistic, because one of the main ideas of monotheism is that God is fundamentally transcendent, not part of the world, fundamentally different from humanity. And in these texts, God is very mysteriously different from humanity in a way that we can't quite get our heads around, precisely because God retains a unity, even as God has more than one manifestation. And even, I think, more than one physical manifestation, more than one body.
Right, yeah.
Well, I think there are other biblical texts in which it works differently. I think for the priestly texts, God does have one body, and the priestly texts use the word kavod to describe that body. Kavod, often translated as the glory or the presence of God.
Right.
But for the priestly texts, well, God's body might seem similar to a human body. It has the same basic shape, more or less, as a human body. In Genesis, I think chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. In Ezekiel chapter 1, also verse 27, as it happens. Ezekiel is closely related to the priestly texts of the Pentateuch. God has one body, but that body isn't made of flesh. It's made of an intense energy that's so intense that if you were to look at it directly, even from a distance, you would be killed. And that one body, it can be very small, it can grow very, very large. So there's one body that has the shape of a human body, but it has a different substance and it has an ability to be huge, to be small. So there again, there's the sense that, well, God is kind of like us, but completely different from us. In a different way, the P text, which is not a fluidity text, because God only has one self and one body for P, is also doing what the fluidity texts are doing. They're trying to describe a sense in which God is like us, and then God is infinitely not like us, and something that we can't quite understand.
Yeah. Yeah, these are amazing topics, and as we mentioned before, we are unable to fathom God. So these type of subjects are something that we can talk about a couple more hours. But I wanted to ask you one more question. In your book, you already mentioned that the New Testament also attests to the fluidity model. And one of the quotes that you said is that the Trinity model, compared to what the Bible like holistically is talking about in certain places, it does not scathe away the Trinity model, and especially also not the incarnation. There was also something that you were talking about it in the Christian theology. The incarnation, in contrast with the fluidity model, is possible, and it is a perfectly Jewish one, you said. So, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the New Testament's idea, for example, in the first chapter of John, of well, actually the opening chapters of John altogether, of God coming down and overlapping with Jesus, or God being at once the Logos who is with God and thus separate from God, but is also God. That sounds like very strange language, but when you're familiar with the fluidity model from the ancient Near East, which some texts of the Hebrew Bible contain, I think that we realize that those sort of models you're getting in the New Testament are actually not new models in Judaism. This is a first century type of Judaism that is hearkening back to the fluidity model that ancient Israel had inherited from the ancient Near East. The idea of the Trinity, which I think most New Testament scholars would say is not yet quite fully present in the New Testament, but gets articulated in post-New Testament literature. The idea of the Trinity too I think it's really a new way of repackaging the ancient Israelite fluidity model.
Right.
I think that that's interesting. And when I was writing the book, this was really quite surprising to me, because I think generally obviously Jews don't believe in the Trinity, of course. I don't believe in the Trinity. But Jews not only don't believe in the Trinity, I think Jewish philosophers and Jews just generally tend to think that the Trinity is a non-monotheistic model of God. I think a lot of Jews think of the idea of the Trinity as somebody's taking a polytheistic idea and sort of smushing it on top of a monotheistic foundation. And I think a lot of people would even say that the idea of the Trinity is maybe part of the Greek polytheistic heritage of Christianity, that in Christianity, you're sort of combining a Hebrew monotheism with a Hellenistic polytheism. And that the result is the idea of the Trinity already in early Christianity, maybe some of the ideas of incarnation and the idea of the Logos in the New Testament itself. But much to my own surprise, when I was writing this book, it occurred to me that, well, actually, the Trinity is a kind of fluidity model. It's the idea that one deity can have more than one manifestation, more than one aspect, more than one person. And if that's the case, then the Trinity is just a new way of utilizing a much more ancient theological model that was native to ancient Israel. And in fact, when you start thinking about it that way, this idea that three can be one, it's not so radically different from the Kabbalistic idea that there are 10 major manifestations of God in the created world, manifestations that are known as the Sfirot. And
Right.
Kabbalah really emphasizes you shouldn't think of these 10 different Sfirot as different beings. You should never pray to one of these Sfirot by itself. These 10 Sfirot are all somehow one. But in the world, they appear to us as 10 different manifestations, but they're interacting. They come from a unity, and they ultimately achieve a unity in the long run. And even, again, on the Sabbath, they achieve a greater degree of unity. Well, if within Judaism there are Kabbalists who consider themselves monotheistic, who believe in 10 Sfirot, well, then I think that Jews have to realize that the Trinity, although we don't believe in the Trinity is based on a theological model that we also do see as present in Judaism. I think it's present in that something similar, not identical, but something analogous is happening in Kabbalah. And I think that when one goes back to JE texts in the Pentateuch and some other biblical texts, the idea that Shem and Kavod and Panim, God's name, God's presence, God's face, can act on their own, not merely on behalf of God, but as part of God, that idea is analogous to the Trinitarian idea that God can have more than one person. In other words, the Trinity is its own development, not simply of a Hellenistic polytheistic idea that's sort of grafted into a monotheistic Hebrew foundation or tree, if you will. That's actually something that grows out of the monotheistic tree, or out of the monotheistic soil to begin with.
Right. Interesting. Would you then agree that, like on this concept of revelation, that throughout time we more and more know a bit more about God? For instance, are you of the agreement that Isaiah knew more about God, as far as a human being can know, than Moses?
That's an interesting question. First, before getting to Isaiah and Moses, sure. Yes, I do agree that over time that we can gain from previous generations new insights into God. We can stand on the shoulders of previous generations. We can combine previous generations' insights to go somewhere where those previous generations hadn't gone. I think that it's often the case that we might even be able, in our own new setting, to understand more fully what somebody said centuries or even millennia ago. I think that sometimes happens, that somebody says something and the full import and even meaning of what the first person said isn't understood until centuries later. So in that regard, I think that in many respects, revelation in some sense continues, or maybe we hear nuances in an older revelation that older generations didn't hear. So even if it was still just a revelation that occurred in the past, at some level that revelation continues to speak, and even speaks in new ways as we go into the future. I think that this is an idea that one finds in a certain kind of Jewish theology. I deal a lot more with that theology in my book on Revelation at Sinai. So I think that that's a very traditional kind of Jewish theology, more at home in the more mystical or Kabbalistic strains of Judaism and their predecessors in rabbinic literature than in the rationalist point of view. So generally I agree with that. I also think it's the case, though, that there were insights in the past that we've lost that are really useful insights that we need to go back to. And in a sense, that's what I'm doing in the book on God's bodies. I'm saying that there was this fluidity theology in ancient Israel, and people have kind of lost it. We know about its later manifestations in Jewish mysticism, also in some parts of rabbinic literature, but the fact that it's got its own form, that it's present in its own way in the Bible itself, is something I think that we've really lost. And the whole point of that book that I wrote was to kind of recover that. So there may also be respects in which there are older revelations that that know something that we ought to try to recover. Mm. As for Isaiah and Moses, I wouldn't want to go too much into specifics. It certainly is a bedrock idea of Judaism that Moses was the greatest of the prophets. And so I think that I'd be hesitant about making that statement that Isaiah knew more than Moses, but I think I would be comfortable saying that Isaiah expresses aspects of God and articulates aspects of God more explicitly that in Moses' case are not articulated as explicitly. I think I would put it that way.
No, that's an interesting answer. Thank you. And just touching upon what you said before, that when John says, for instance, uses in his prologue, in the beginning was the word, what was God, that whole concept, he didn't pluck that out of thin air, right? So
A, he didn't plug it out of thin air, and B, he's not only getting it indirectly from Plato. He's not just getting it from Greek culture. Certainly Hellenistic culture is contributing to the way he's formulating us. The wording he uses probably is indebted indirectly to Plato, but that's a matter of the wording. The conception of a deity who is multiple and yet still fundamentally one, that's an idea that John is getting from his Jewish heritage and from the heritage of Hebrew scripture.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, it was very interesting. Dr. Benjamin, Sommer. Yeah, what can I say, guys? If you love this subject, you already know where to find it. I'll put the link to the book in the description, of course, 100%. Dr. Sommer, what can I say? It has been a delight to have you here. I wish you nothing but the best in your academical work, in your personal life, in your spiritual life. May everything that is good be with you and your family, of course. I've enjoyed it a lot, and I cannot wait to put this one online and to edify everyone even more. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your diligence. And yeah, may God bless you. And hopefully maybe in the future we'll speak to each other again.
That would be great. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me, Vartan.
Bye, guys and girls. Guys and girls, thank you everybody for watching, and up until next time.